It's very good to be with you, and it's a real pleasure to say just a few introductory words about Trollope's Can You Forgive Her? It's one of his strongest novels, and one that I hope you will thoroughly enjoy. Those of you who haven't yet read it, I imagine some of you will have done so, but not all. So I'm going to start with just a few words about its publication history, where it fits into Trollope's career. It was published first as a volume in 1865, but in parts through 1864, 1865, and it was the first of Trollope's 6 Palliser novels, as we now usually call them. Trollope would call them his parliamentary novels. Trollope was at the height of his powers and at the height of his reputation, really. He was 50 years old, roughly. But this is a novel, and it's worth remembering this, that overlaps with the conclusion of the Barsetshire series. There was still one more Barsetshire novel to come, and a very fine one, I should say, The Last Chronicle of Barset, which was published in 1867. And Can You Forgive Her, in fact, follows very close on the heels of The Small House at Allington, published in 1864. So all of these novels are kind of rushing along, and they're pretty close together. And they do, it seems to me, share a cultural, social, political, and fictional context. And they are clustered at a certain point in Trollope's creative life. So those of you who have read Small House may remember that that novel introduced for the first time Plantagenet Palliser and Lady Glencora, who were to be central in the Palliser novels, and their characters are very much more deeply developed in Can You Forgive Her? Can You Forgive Her does, needless to say, it is the first of the parliamentary novels. It does introduce Trollope's extensive writing and his thinking about politics, about election, about processes of parliament, about the formation and function of governments. It is a political novel. But having said that, like Small House at Allington, its central interest lies in a courtship. Well, more than one courtship, as it happens. And it is, again, like Small House at Allington, preoccupied with the difficulties of courtship and indeed marriage for a young woman. So, though it is a political novel, it's in many ways close in theme to those novels, and they are numerous, in Trollope's oeuvre that brood upon issues to do with relation between the sexes. Think, for instance, of Connections. Those of you who have been pondering Small House at Allington, which is a subject of this reading group previously, the connections between Lily Dale and Alice Vavasor. They are very different characters, but they do have some challenges in common. So, like Small House at Allington, this is a novel that demands our engagement as readers. And in fact, it demands that engagement really very openly and directly. It's a novel with a question as its title, Small House at Allington, although it's clear from the first and from the chapters that you will have read that that is not an open question. And here, again, the novel returns overtly on a point of judgment And that's very characteristic of Trollope's writing. He wants us to involve ourselves in the moral and indeed, I would say, intellectual processes of the novel, to be part of those processes as readers, not just passive recipients, and to decide on questions of judgment. A central question here: can you forgive her? Not, I should add, an entirely open question, in that Trollope does make it clear, really from a very early point in the novel, that he hopes we will forgive the young woman at the heart of the novel Alice Vavasor. Quite what we are to forgive is another issue that calls for further thought. It is in that way, I think, I'm dwelling on the comparison with Small House at Allington, not wholly dissimilar from Small House at Allington, because that novel too is constantly asking us not whether we forgive Lily Dale, but whether we can, as it were, endorse her decision, which so often in the context of that courtship seems perverse. Her loyalty to a man, Dolphus Crosby, who evidently does not deserve that loyalty, and her rejection of a man who has presented himself as very much more deserving of her loyalty. So the title of the novel is a question, not entirely an open question, but there are other questions in this novel that are not easily answered. And again, other Trollopian themes pretty quickly make themselves apparent. Obsession, self-destructive behaviour, those are recurrent themes in Trollope's writing. And again, point of comparison with Lily Dale. And it's a question of, to some extent, who is to be rescued from those self-destructive patterns of behaviour and who is not rescued. And I won't here give the plot away for those of you who haven't yet reached the conclusion of the novel as to how those patterns resolve themselves. And those, I think, are not quite so easily predicted as the answer to the question, can you forgive her? And it's worth noting, since so much of this novel does turn on the relation between the sexes, that self-destruction and obsessive behaviour is not confined either to the men or to the women in the novel. Men and women are equally capable of destroying their own chances of happiness. And we see that very clearly evidenced in this novel, as indeed in other novels by Trollope. There are other themes that I think are interestingly recurrent in Trollope's writing. Violence, for instance, between the central characters. I mean, so often, you will have encountered this, it's so often assumed that Trollope is in some sense a genteel, if that's the word I want, novelist who simply deals with nuanced social relations and the finer details of political life or romantic life. But in fact, throughout his writing career, and really surprisingly often, Trollope does present us with real violence, sometimes threatened, sometimes actual, sometimes with consequences that are calamitous, sometimes with consequences that are to some extent escaped by the protagonists. And this novel, and I don't think I'm giving too much away by saying this, is not an exception to that pattern. And it does, I think, reveal something central in Trollope's imagination, the way in which apparently accepted codes of behaviour within the social classes that he is primarily concerned with, the respectable middle classes, let me put it that way. Those codes of behaviour can break down, and not infrequently do break down in surprising ways. A further theme that I think is overwhelmingly powerful in this novel, and again, not a theme that will be unexpected to you, readers of Trollope that you are, is the power and influence of money. And it would not be unreasonable, I think, to say that this is not, as I have suggested, a novel about either politics or the relation between the sexes, so much as it is a novel about money and the power of money and the way in which relations between the sexes are mediated through the power of money. And I think that is an issue of preoccupation that really runs through so many of Trollope's novel, but never more prominently than in this novel. And there are, again, some questions in this novel that are not very easily answered, and Trollope wants you, indeed asks you, to think about them, doesn't give you the answer in the way that he does about can you forgive her, about, as it were, the moral imperatives around money, the justifications, or in some instances, the lack of justifications for the fact that some people have that power, some people have that security, and some people don't. Some people have that power and use it, at least to some extent, responsibly, and some people don't. Some people evade for honourable or dishonourable reasons the consequences of not having that power, consequences of poverty, and some people don't. And those are undercurrents that run, I think, very powerfully through this novel. You have politics, you have the relation between the sexes, particularly, I think, in terms of the position of young women, and you have money. And all of those questions are aligned with Trollope's thinking, which is now beginning to develop with more sophistication, the relation between the social classes in Trollope's England. And he's always been conscious of that from the first. He's beginning, I think, to make that a more central preoccupation in his fiction. So you see within the layers of the novels the presentation of the challenges that I've been talking about, politics, sexual challenges, financial challenges, as they present themselves to different social classes. It's a very patterned novel, this. Not all of the patterns have quite emerged in the first 14 chapters, but they are outlined. You have women choosing between lovers. One woman, two male lovers, a choice to be made, and a choice with life changes and in some senses really dangerous consequences. So the three women in question, we have Alice Vavasour, we also have Glencora Palliser, who has her own choice to make. And as a different kind of character and a different kind of choice, though not entirely and in every way different, you have Aunt Greenough and her choice between rival suitors. And I think Aunt Greenough is an extremely interesting figure within the novel. A woman of a very different description. Poor Dominic is being very gymnastic I don't quite know what he's doing, but no doubt he will tell us. I think he's got a challenge there. Anyway, leaving aside Dominic's challenge, I think Aunt Greenough is an interesting complementary presence to the two other central female characters in the novel, that is Glencora and Alice. Independent, sensible, strong-minded, perfectly capable of looking after herself and looking after others. The other thing that I would point to as a theme within the novel, just beginning to emerge in the early chapters, is its restlessness. It's a novel in which everyone is on the move. There really is the sense of a world beyond England, America, France, Switzerland, all making an appearance. And as the narrative develops, a sense of different places in England. You haven't read far enough to encounter all of those places, but you've read far enough to have that sense of restlessness. And as you read on, you encounter London, different districts in London, the flatness of Cambridgeshire, the sporting landscapes of Oxfordshire. And I should just mention the fact that this is a novel where Trollope himself makes an appearance as a heavyweight literary gentleman, a sporting gentleman, and of course the wilderness, the wildness of Westmoreland, the agricultural richness of Norfolk. They're very, very different places in Can You Forgive Her? It's one of the strengths of the novel, I think. Trollope was himself, you will know this, a restless traveller. And in its narrative focus, in its locations, the way in which we are looking at the action, it never stands still. So finally, a few words about the reception of the novel. It was never the most popular of his novels in his lifetime, or perhaps since. Never unpopular, but not the most popular novel, despite what I would argue to be its real richness and strength. And it is interesting to ask why that may be. It is long. Some people have felt that it is too long. I wouldn't feel that myself, given the way in which it develops its themes, but some have felt it too long. The American novelist Stephen King once said, you may have come across this comment, shouldn't be called Can You Forgive Her? Should be called Can You Finish It? So I hope you won't have any problems in finishing it. But some have felt it's long. Maybe that's one reason. Some have felt, and this is a question worth asking yourself as you read through, is the novel to some extent undermining its own narrative resources with a lack of suspense, in that it answers its own question really from the very start. Another question that readers have asked themselves, and perhaps you will ask yourself, is a problem with the novel that it's hard to find any of the central characters wholly and entirely sympathetic or likable in the way that we might, for instance, many have, feel that Lily Dale is a very likable character, whatever you may feel about the decisions that she makes. Is that not so much the case with the characters here, or would you argue that is not an accurate or fair criticism? It is certainly true that some of the characters in the novel are thoroughly repellent, but then, of course, that would be true of very many of Trollope's novels. In his own lifetime, I think one reason for its being quite a challenging novel for his readership, as it were, to swallow or entirely to praise, is that it was very open about a question that really was beginning to trouble Trollope, that is the social position of women. Of course, he doesn't deviate. In some ways, it's a socially conservative novel, doesn't deviate from that central conviction that marriage and motherhood, very good things for women. But the novel repeatedly examines his, as it were, concern, if that's the word I want, about the constraints around women's lives and around the choices they can make. This is a novel very much about choices, and they're choices for men and women, but choices for women are absolutely at the center of the novel. And Trollope makes it easy to see. Let me put this in a way that doesn't give the plot away to you. Makes it easy to see why Alice and Glencora both do not find those choices easy. And some of the women, particularly those women, and there are a couple of them, very movingly presented in Can You Forgive Her, who are struggling with real poverty, do, I think, present the vulnerability of women in a very graphic and direct way that certainly made some of his readers at the time uncomfortable. And one of the reasons that really begins to emerge as a central theme in this novel, it's not a new theme in Trollope, but it's very prominent, and it's very much in relation to those other questions about money, sex, sexual relations, is the theme of work and the relation that that theme has with those other subjects. The worthy male characters in Trollope's fiction, certainly in this novel, increasingly actually, are workers. And those who don't work for whatever reason, because they choose not to, or because circumstances conspire against them, are undermined. In some instances, some examples, you might say almost degraded by the fact that they do not work or cannot work or choose not to work. But women are excluded in Trollope's fictional world, or at least middle-class women are excluded from the world of work. And I think that that is a source of uneasiness for Trollope as his thinking develops, and I would argue deepens, about the relations between men and women and the relations between men and women and the society that surrounds them and supports them. I would suggest that what's particularly admirable in this novel, thoroughly enjoyable, is the way in which these different themes, very different characters with different choices, are knitted together, if you like, within the story. And that the way in which they move, change, develop, come to understand themselves, or in some instance fail to understand themselves, those developments, as it were, shed light on the central movements of the novel. It's a complex novel from that point of view. And in my view, because it is complex and because it does develop those relations with such care and thought, in my view, is not too long for the work that it wants to do. These themes develop within the context of the moving wheels, if you like, of a subtly rendered social, political, economic context. And I find it a totally absorbing novel from so many different perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you all make of it when we meet again. I think it's the 14th of November, is that right, Dominic? When we next meet.